Hi, Lorraine here. Today I am going to talk about some textures that you can use for watercolor. And I am a master artist for Mastrius.com. It is a program for mentoring artists that's based out of Canada. And if you're interested in that, there's more information on my website. But for that group, I was talking about texture that you can use in your watercolors and how that texture can make your watercolors more interesting, and it can replicate what we can do with acrylics or oils in some sense, and it just gives more life to your watercolors. And so there's a huge variety of textures that you can use. But today I'm just going to talk about 6 of them, and if you would like to leave a comment with textures that you've used below the video, please feel free to do that. And I will get my cameras turned around here and we'll get going. Alright, so you can see that I have a variety of things laid out over here on the left, and then I've labeled my paper, and I do have a couple things I need to do on a couple of these squares before I get going. So one of them will be to add some, let's see, where am I? Add some color here. I do need to add a shape up here, and then I want to put some, actually I'll wait on this one. So what I will be doing basically is getting a couple of these areas kind of prepped, and then I'll zoom in on each area and we can start working on one individual block. And so the first one I do have some color out on my palette from something else I was doing. Let me grab a towel here. And I think I can probably use that. I'm going to get out just a touch more. Oh, not what I was using before. Let's see. So the first technique, using the water bottle spray, will be using a water bottle that you can adjust the spray. So you can get spray bottles that are a mist type of spray bottle, but for this one I want to be able to adjust it because I am looking to get a variety of sizes with the spray. I don't want it to just be the little mist dots of water. So basically I'm making something that could relate to a rock formation. And I'm leaving a separate area because there's a couple different things. Well, there's more than a couple, but there's 2 that I'm going to show you with the water spray that you can use in a painting. So just kind of a random rock mass sitting here. Okay, and then that needs to dry. Now you could, at this point, if you wanted to, actually I'll show you. So this is a third method. I'm just going to add to my video as I'm going here. Okay, so I'll put some color on the paper, and then as this starts to lose a little bit of its shine, if it's really shiny, then this does not work as well because the water will just hit the paper and then it will kind of blend in with the paint. So I do need the shine to just kind of reduce a little bit, and then I can use the spray bottle on here. So I do need to be careful I don't get spray over here because I'm doing a different method with that one. So I don't know if you can tell. Yeah, it's still shiny. It's not too bad now. I'll give it just a few more seconds, and then I will be zooming in, but I wanted to just show you this very quick. Okay, so my spray bottle is the kind that I can adjust the top, and I'm just going to hold it kind of a distance back and spritz, and I'm just barely pulling on the trigger. So I don't want to pull back very much because it will spray too hard. So basically, with the water bottle, you can create little miniature blooms. And sometimes those blooms are something that you might actually want to use as a texture in your painting. And it can add some variety to the values. It can give some texture to a shape. I use this in backgrounds a lot. Sometimes I'll use it in things like foliage for trees and plants. Yeah, I'm sure there's a variety of other ways that you could use that method. So I will let those two dry, and I'll go put some color on in this one, and then we can move on. Oh, actually, I do want to put a little color here as well, because there's part of the process I can show you on this one, and having it be dry would be good. Okay, so let's go to this one since I have paint out, sort of, that would work. I don't want it to be too intense. I had green gold on my palette from something I was working on with a student. We were painting a hummingbird, and so she and I were working together. So I do offer private lessons. It depends on my schedule and the timing and all of that, what I have available, but I can do online private lessons as well as the in-person lessons that I do. So that is an option, but I also have video lessons on my website that you can purchase and you can go through and do in your own time. And so those are available. And those videos, the link and the passwords and all of that do not expire, so you can take your time, and if you can't get it all done quickly, then you can always go back and work on it. So what I'm doing here is just sort of making a form of a bush or top of a tree or something like that, and then later I will come back and add some with the sea sponge on top of this. So for now, I'll just let that dry. Just a variety of greens, and then the last one is down here with the credit card. So for this one, I'm going to get out some random colors. Well, not totally random, but some color. And let's see, I think I'll put some purple in there. I'm going to have to clean my palette here in a few seconds so I can actually have the color out that I want to use. And get some cerulean. And these colors will look very odd and maybe very intense for what it will end up being. Alright, so I'm going to start maybe here. And again, I'm thinking rocks, so I'm kind of creating a mass of rocks that are kind of jumbled together, and these are not supposed to make a whole lot of sense right now because of maybe the odd colors, but it will make more sense later. More cerulean. Okay, so I will leave that. I'm going to zoom in so that we can work on the water bottle spray section, and then later when these are dry, I can come back and show you those different textures. I'll be right back. Alright, so I have adjusted things, and I am going to talk about the water bottle spray first. So there's quite a few ways and things that you can do with water bottle spray, and the one that I laid the color down first, that one is going to be lifting, and so I need to add some spray to the paper, and sometimes I will not mask, but lay paper or paper towels around, so maybe I only want to get the spray right in here, so just be aware that if you've got a full painting going, that you may want to protect other parts of the paper if you're just trying to lift in one area. Same thing again, I'm going to hold my spray bottle back. It's about, maybe 10 inches or so from my paper, and I will only be gently touching this so that just a little bit of spray will come out. And I'm trying to protect up here because I'm going to do something else up there. And so I'm just going to spritz, and then I will lift. Hopefully you can see those water droplets on there. So I got kind of a random disbursement, and there's some small and big, some that are kind of connected. Now what you want to do is you count to about 30 seconds. And while that's doing its thing, I'm going to go ahead and get some color out to use over here. And I often use this next method with trees and foliage and things like that. So you could use it for other things if there's something that this texture would relate to, but yeah, it's just one of the ones that I use a lot for trees or bushes or that kind of thing. All right. So I think that's probably been about 30 seconds, I'm guessing. I have not actually been counting this time. So when you do this, basically those water droplets are waking up the pigment and softening it so that when you go to press, so you want to use a paper towel or a towel, and you're going to press and then twist. And by twisting, you're actually giving a little bit of texture, or not texture, sorry, pressure, and you're basically moving the paint. So you could just try to press. Sometimes that will take off some color, but by twisting your towel, you're actually going to lift more. And certain paints down as your first coat, or as your coat of paint, will lift better than others. So it would be something maybe to test, and you can definitely see a difference in the look. So these are more controlled. This is often used by me and others for rocks. I could do it again, so if I decided, well, I like that, but it's maybe not enough texture, I can spritz again and add some more to it. And then this one has got a definitely more natural feel to it, and very interesting texture. And so this paint was Indian Throne, and it, I think, had a little bit of brown in it. So and different pigments will give you different looks with the blooms. So sometimes when I do this, I don't get all of those really big, it doesn't push back as much. It'll be just a little bloom with a little bit of value change that makes an area interesting. So this one bloomed a little more, which for me could be very interesting depending on what I'm doing with it. Okay, I'm going to get out some new gamboge as well. Okay, and so then the next thing that you can do with a water bottle is, I'll just protect these again, is just spritz on the water. And so I would maybe have my tree shape already drawn out, and then I would spritz kind of in the area where maybe on the edges or even in the middle of the tree shape. So what happens when you have water on your paper and it's not like a wet on wet wash where everything is wet, when you go to add color, let me get a little bit. So right now I'm actually going to touch right next to the water, and see where I touch next to the water, it grabs my paint and it creates its own shape. So when I'm using this to do for foliage, I'm not actually looking for the water, but as I'm painting, it will grab some of my paint and it actually helps paint the shape. So it helps me be a little more random with my mark, and it can give soft and hard edges, and then you don't have to use, you know, the whole shape. So I do have water that went way over in here, but I can basically create my tree or my bush and get a little bit of a more interesting look to that form because the water is pulling at the paint and helping create the look of it. And so you can get rough and hard and soft edges as well. So that I will often use when I am working with foliage. So there are 3 options to use a spray bottle, and if you have any others, you're welcome to comment below and mention those. Okay, and then I'm going to slide this over. All right, so watercolor pencils and sandpaper. So I will talk about the watercolor pencils first. And so there's a couple ways you can use watercolor pencils. You can take a watercolor pencil and basically just draw with it on your paper. So you're adding texture because of how the pencil, this is cold press watercolor paper, how it kind of skips on the surface and doesn't fill in completely. Then if you want to make it look more like watercolor, you can wet it and release the paint from the shape. Some pencils will disperse more than others. I don't know what brand that was. I don't hardly ever pull these out. This is Sakura brand, and so it released a lot of the pigment. Let's see what else I have here. These are Crayola watercolors I think my kids had. So when I do that, some are more waxy and some are harder. So you can see the texture of the pencil. My camera, come on. There it goes. You can see the texture of the watercolor pencil more with that one. And then the other way would be to put water on the paper, and then you can use the pencil on top of it. So some of that will blur a little bit, and just like my camera is doing, it will blur a little bit, and then it will stay. Actually, let me go into my settings right quick. I'm going to make sure it's not going to keep refocusing. Just a second. Well, apparently there is not a way to stop my overhead camera from focusing whenever it wants, so hopefully it will behave. So, as I was saying, there's a variety of textures you can get from just using the pencil that way. You can also, let me grab, I'm going to pull out another pencil, hopefully this one will be a little darker. You can just take the paint off of the pencil. So maybe you're going to go paint plein air, and you don't want to carry a palette. You can wet the pencil and then just pull the paint and use it directly from the pencil. Now, I do not know how water or light fast the pigment is from these pencils. So that may be something that if you're concerned about having the watercolor fade over time, that you would investigate and figure out if you want to use this method. So that's not really a texture, but that's just an option that you could use with the watercolor pencils. So one thing that I have done with a watercolor pencil is that sometimes I will use it as a texture and use it with the sandpaper to get that texture. So I am going to pull out some burnt sienna and a little cobalt, and I'll just make sort of a grayish brown. And I've actually used this for aspen trees and on paths in like a garden scene or that kind of idea. And not necessarily these colors, but then what you do once you have your paint down is you use a piece of rough sandpaper, and basically you're sanding off the edge of your pencil and putting it onto the paper with the sandpaper. And so it gives a very textural look. The paint does need to be dry or wet still, or damp, I should say, not wet. If it's too wet, it might disperse a lot, but with it damp, the pencil will basically adhere to your paper. Now, if you do this method, you want to make sure that it is the last thing that you're going to do in that area, because if you come back with a brush or water or paint on top of that, basically it will just lift that color and blur it, and you won't get that texture. So I'll zoom in just so you can see that a little better. And so it has a real nice small little dots texture. Now you can get something sort of similar with like a toothbrush and watercolor, but with this method, the whoops, trying to not bump my camera. The little dots of pigment are really intense, and they're all about the same size, just little tiny speckles on there. So this one would be interesting to try for a variety of things for texture. All right, so I'm going to go up this way, and I did cheat. You may have noticed I did not put this on earlier when I was doing the other color, because I did not remember that I wanted to show you two methods with this. So there are plastic watercolor, or not watercolor, plastic templates that you can use, probably originally meant for scrapbooking, where you can take a shape and draw it and cut it out, and or use it for doing some line work or that kind of thing. And in my investigations for the session with my Masteries group, thought, oh, okay, I'll try this. I don't actually use this. I don't tend to want this kind of, for right now, I should say. I may at some point, but right now I don't use this kind of line work or texture in my paintings, but at some point I might. I think I will grab my orange because I can. So this is transparent pearl orange, and I was actually really surprised at how well the paint worked around this template, and you do have to give it a little bit of pressure and kind of hold it. Now I moved it just now, so it might have seeped under. We'll see. All right. And also, if it's laid flat, it probably will work a little better, because then there's a less of a possibility of the paint possibly going under it. So you can see that worked pretty well. And let's see. Well, it's going to be hard to do it now. Okay. Let me see if I can get, without putting the template on my other area. And so this is showing the shapes, and they're enclosed, so we'll see if the paint seeps under, and they did okay. So this is something that could be very handy for, especially if you were working with an abstract scene, or maybe you have a pattern in your painting that you would like a way to just create it without having to draw and paint all of the individual shapes. So that is an option there. I'm going to clean my brush just to get the paint off of it. And then I put this color down because I wanted to show you that you can also use this to lift color back. Now, when I did it the first time, the color, or the water, did seep under a little bit. When you are working with paint that's already on your paper, it actually does create a little bit of a raised, I mean, it's very minimal. You'd have to look under a microscope to see it, but it does create a little bit of a raised area. And so when I did it the first time, some of the water did seep under the template just a little bit. It didn't cause an issue just because I wasn't pressing with it or anything. But I would just note that maybe this is something to test before you would try to do it yourself. And there are other ways to do this kind of thing. So that did lift a section there, and then I could try it as well on the edge. This is a Royal brand, and it's a flat brush. It's not real stiff. I do have stiffer bristle brushes, which I might try because this will lift, but it will take longer and it won't maybe lift back as much color. Let's see. So it is lifting. I'm going to pull out my other brush, and this one has a stiffer bristle to it, so it should lift more. Now, one thing to be aware of whenever you're lifting, this is abrading the paper a little bit, and so it can be something that the paper then will look a little different in that area, but also, and see, the water did seep under right there. If you wanted to paint in that area, then you have to maybe let it rest, possibly come back. You could take a spoon and sort of burnish that area, press down on the fibers, and that might make it look more like it did before you lifted. So those are all different methods that you could use, or those two methods are things you could use with a template like this. Okay, let me move that. All right, sea sponge. So we had color down here because I was mentioning that I wanted to show you a couple things with the sea sponge. And so when you buy the sea sponge, sometimes they'll come in a bigger sponge. And what I usually do is I will pull them apart or cut them down to smaller sponges. And I tend to like the ones that have these bigger openings and a variety of shapes. And I don't usually use something like that. So I kind of rotate the sponge and find the area that's going to work best for what I'm doing, and maybe test it as well. And then sometimes you'll get sponges like this that are a tighter form to it. And I actually found out the other day when I was demoing for the group that the sponge actually worked better than I thought it would. I think I've used something similar in the past, and either I didn't do it right or my paint wasn't right, but I had the feeling that it didn't work well. So, but it did work. So I will pull out a little bit of color off of my palette, and you can kind of load it up with a variety of colors, and so you can see that I'm getting some interesting texture. It is definitely a smaller texture, and it helps if your paint is not really wet. If your paint is really wet, then you don't get enough paint sitting on the surface of the sponge. So there's that one. And I'll go ahead and rinse this. And this texture could be used like on old wood. You could use it on the walls, like a stucco wall of a building. You could use this in the like a trail, so that there's lots of little texture, like little pebbles or something on there. And let me we'll try this one. And I'm going to pull out a little more paint. Now the sponges are very stiff when they're haven't been wet for a while, and they do dry back and are stiff again. So I do get them wet and then wring them out. Let me pull out some new gamboge. And I've got some blue sitting here. Okay, so I'll just kind of do the same thing. I'm just loading it up with some color. I think I lost all my new gamboge. And then sometimes what I will do once the sponge is loaded up, sometimes I squeeze it, sometimes I'll just use it open, and when you squeeze it, that condenses the textures and the shapes. And again, I'm looking for a variety of the form. So when I use a sponge, I tend to rotate it. So I'm not always using it the same direction. So now for this is actually pretty dark. So I need to pull out darker pigment and make sure that my value will be seen when I put it on. So I'm going to get out more cobalt. And I think I will pull out New Gamboge again. So when you're doing this kind of texture, you could literally take, do your first layer, let it dry, come back with some more color, add another layer, so that you're slowly building the texture of that foliage or whatever you're creating there. So you don't have to start with a base coat of color. You can just use the texture of the sponge. I'm going to get that a little wet. And then we'll see if I got this dark enough. So now that I've got my base coat, I can, as I mentioned, come back and start adding texture. And depending on how dark your values are, it may just add a little bit of texture, or you could add even another layer. So I'll dry this and I'll be right back. All right, so I have a little bit more pigment out. And this time I did go in and pick up some ultramarine blue so that I would have a much darker value going on, and all of those different layers are just going to add texture. Now if you were doing something where you wanted to be very controlled about the shape and you didn't want these little edges here, then that was something where you just lay a piece of paper on that. And this now has some nice form to it because I've got some different values, and it's in an abstract kind of textural way that I've created it. So it is a little less contrived maybe than I might paint it, which sometimes it's very hard to be random and create sort of a realistic looking foliage shape. So that works well for that. All right, now we're going to try this next one, and hopefully it will work for me, because sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so for this one, there's a couple things you can do with a credit card or something like the end of a brush. So sometimes I will use a brush like this that has a rounded curve to it. In fact, I'll show you that first, and I'll just use some of the color I have sitting here. So you can paint on color, and some people will use this for grasses or tree branches, that kind of thing. And I can take a just an old cut up gift card or credit card, and if you have a pointed edge, you could try that. So the pointed edge is going to groove the paper and give you a dark line while the paint is still damp. The rounded corner will also give you a grooved edge, but it may be a little bigger size. And then let me try this one. So now the paint is starting to dry, but it's not quite dry, so I'm actually able to push it. And we'll try over here with the round end on my paintbrush. And so when you use this method, depending on how wet or how dry the paint is, you will get either a darker line or somewhere in between, and then at some point, no, that's too dry. Sometimes you can get an actual just nice clean white line. So that one was a little better. And that is a way that you can create lines and grasses and branches and things without having to either paint them on or possibly reserve those whites and either use masking fluid or paint around them. So that's one method with the credit card. And then I need to pull out some paint, so I'm going to clean off just a little bit. So for this next method, I need to have some dark pigment to layer on top of this. And so I'm going to pull out some ultramarine blue, and I will probably get out more burnt sienna. And I can make an almost black from this. It is a really deep gray or blue-gray, or it could be a dark brown, depending on how much you have of each color in the mix. All right. Okay. And then I'm going to just take this and layer it over the whole area. And I do have to move with a little bit of speed, one, to get this covered, and then I need to start watching the paint. So I want to catch it when it is starting to lose a little bit of the shine. So it's very much like what was going on up here. If it's too wet, it's not going to work. If it's too dry, it will not work. So it's kind of in between. I do see like right up in there is starting to dry, so I'll see if I can get that to work. And basically I'm thinking rock shapes. Maybe if I go the opposite direction. There we go. And what this is doing is creating both the darker value at the bottom of these shapes because it's moving. You can see the paint kind of piling up here, and it's also lifting a lighter edge depending on how I am able to work with the credit card and move the paint. And so it creates, or can create, the look of rocks, and it shadows them, it gives them form. Those early colors that I had on there that were really intense and probably thinking, what the heck, those aren't rock colors. Now they seem a little more natural, like maybe the warmer tones in some rocks and then cooler values or cooler colors in other rocks. Actually, this probably was the most effective right down in this bottom edge. And so this is definitely something to play with, but it does create a very interesting texture and form for rocks, and it's something that as you perfect it, you'll know exactly when to work with it, and you'll get sort of your method of creating the marks down better. Now, I don't necessarily use this very often. If I'm trying to think if I've used it in a painting, maybe once, but I often don't also paint rocks very often. So, but it is a really interesting way to work with watercolor and create texture. It probably could be used for other things, so if you've ever used it for anything besides rocks, please let me know, and that would be really nice for the community to hear that other option. Okay, so over here we have the last texture in this group, and that will be embroidery floss. And embroidery floss comes in a skein, I guess, and so we don't need the whole thing. I just cut off some pieces. I've used these before, so they're a little stiff. And there's a couple different ways that you could use this, and one is to take the floss, and I'm going to pull out some sap green just to have something different, and then basically I'm just going to put it in my paint and get it nice and saturated. Now, you might want to use gloves if you're using this method a lot so that you don't get paint all over yourself. But see if I can pick it up with my brush. I'm being extra special this morning. I don't want to pick it up. All right. So then I'm going to basically lay it on the paper and see if I can kind of press it down and leave it. So that will dry, and wherever that paint was on the embroidery floss, once it's dry, I can lift that off and we'll see the texture that we got. So that's one method. Another would be to take the floss, and I'll actually need to cut this so that there we go. Have a couple pieces. Okay, so then you could take the floss, let's go to peacock blue because it is a very pretty blue. And basically, again, you're going to saturate it with, whoops, put it in my other paint. Saturate it with pigment and, come on, and then you can sort of loop it around on your paper. See if I can get it to, nope. So you can pull and use the texture of the paint. It doesn't have enough paint on there. Let me see if I can load it up better. Okay, that might work better. So you can use it to create lines and shapes, and then depending on how you move it on your paper and overlap or not, you'll get a texture that way. And it's very rough and random. I'm not sure what I would want to use that for. And then the other option would be to use it on paper that's wet. So I'll just put some kind of water up in there, and then clean my brush well. Go into my yellow, so there's some variety to see, and pull out some more paint and make sure that this is nice and loaded. Okay. And then I can lay it on there, and I could either leave it like this and let any paint that comes off sort of release and put some color on the paper, or I can do that same kind of lifting and twisting and turning thing to get some pattern and marks and things happening. So it is a messier process, but it can create some interesting marks that are not necessarily something that if someone sees it, they're going to go, oh, I know how they created that thing. So let me pull this. Actually, let me dry it right quick. So one of the things about the textures in your painting is textures can add to your painting, but they shouldn't necessarily, unless you're doing something that is more abstract and it is all about the texture, they shouldn't necessarily take over your image. So I would rather have someone see my painting and be interested in the image and what that story is, or what that painting makes that person feel, than them coming away and going, oh, that was a really cool texture. So there may be a little bit of that, but it should be about the painting as a whole, and that your textures that you're using support what you're doing in your painting. So I'm going to zoom out. All right, and as I mentioned, these are only 6 different things that you could use for texture in a watercolor. I think I had something like 25 or 30 the other day, and we were still coming up with other options for textures. If I get a chance and want to, I might do another video showing some of the other options, but please feel free to comment and leave something down below this video that does talk about textures maybe that you've used. And I hope it was interesting to see the variety, and I hope you have a good day, and I will see you soon. Thanks. Bye.